So, who is New Zealand's most spied on man? Well, here are some more clues. 1, he was 11 years old when the security service started tracking him. 2, he grew up in Christchurch, has a BSc from Canterbury University, a Masters in Sociology from the University of Alberta. 3, he's been a railway worker, a freezing worker, a bookseller, an editor, and a university lecturer. And 4, his political life has taken him through memberships in the Socialist Action League, the New Labour Party, the Alliance, and the Greens. And the security service was still tracking him after he entered Parliament on the Green ticket in 1999. Well, now, no prizes for guessing. Of course, he is Keith Locke. And Keith Locke's been talking to Selwyn Manning about a life under the spy's eyes.
Keith Locke, welcome to the program.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
From the age of 11 years, you became a target of the Security Intelligence Service. This is your SIS file here, and it records almost everything that you did over the next 50 years. What is it like to realise that you have been the target of an SIS surveillance team for 5 decades?
Well, it is a bit freaky and quite upsetting, really, because here am I, a person who hasn't got a criminal record at all. The only reason they were spying on me was because I was dissenting from the government policies of the day over a long period, particularly on international issues, the Vietnam War, apartheid, nuclear weapons, etc. So there was no reason for this spying, but as you've said, they followed my every move, where I was working, where I was living, what car I was driving, trying to stop me getting jobs, everything to counter what I was doing. And my file is just an example of many New Zealanders who are involved in movement for social change, who were spied on by the Security Intelligence Service over those decades.
And for the viewers' benefit, I'll just go through a summary of your file here. Over that 50 years, the SIS covertly photographed you. We've got photographs here of a very youthful and young Keith Locke. And we've got photographs of you having meetings, photographs of you just walking down the street, sitting at a park bench. The SIS noted your relationships, romantic or otherwise. It interfered in your employment, as you alluded to just then. It corresponded with your employers. It tracked your movements. It tracked your speaking engagements. The SIS filed information on your vehicle, the vehicle you drove, the new vehicles that you purchased. The SIS analysed your character, your appearance, right down to the gold tooth in your mouth. When you said that you know, that it was most likely because of the activities and your political views that attracted the SIS, how can that be when you're at the age of 11, for example, when you first became in the spotlight?
Well, my mother and father were members of the Communist Party. My mother left in 1956 after the Soviet invasion of Hungary, but the Communist Party was a particular target, and they didn't only target the members of the Communist Party, but even children, myself, my brother and my sisters as well. So, you know, that's what they did, the New Zealand SIS and Western intelligence agencies through that period.
That Cold War period, because one of the files here, it actually notes that at a church meeting, it was a communist gathering, as how the document states it, way back in 1955, and it notes of the people that the SIS officer identified here, one being your mother, and then it notes down the bottom of the document that Elsie Locke, your mother, is going to be taking or accompanying Keith Locke on a hiking trip in January. It seems like it's absolutely not only invasive but quite thorough on detail of really what is happening in family events as well.
Yes, they didn't respect the privacy of people like myself and members of my family, and I think that's one of the problems with intelligence agencies, that they are so intrusive into people's privacy and personal life. And now, of course, the spying is even more comprehensive in some ways, in that with the electronic surveillance systems they have, they can invade your privacy even more.
So with that electronic surveillance and the advent of that over the last, say, 20 years, you feel that the ability for the SIS and its affiliate agencies is much more intrusive, not only in theory but in practice?
I'm not sure about the practice. One of the problems with intelligence agencies is that they are so secretive and you never really get a full picture. But the last entry into my file while I was an MP was in relation to a trip I made to Sri Lanka, a sort of a peacemaking mission to talk to both sides in the conflict between the Tamils and the Sinhalese majority government.
Well, let's look at that, because that became a big issue. Not only had you been under surveillance during those decades prior to you being an MP, but also during that period, in the first part of the 12 years that you were a Member of Parliament as a Green Party MP, that your file was still open. I remember there was quite a discussion in Parliament relating to that. How did that take place?
Well, they were either targeting me or targeting the Tamil people I was talking to prior to this trip, presumably by electronic or telephone interception from the information on the file. And that did create something of a storm, that a government agency would be targeting an MP, particularly one that's not involved in any criminal behaviour. And that's the problem with the Security Intelligence Service, is that it's an agency dealing with political issues and dealing with people who are opposed to government policies.
As opposed to a criminal...
As opposed to the police that's dealing with criminality. And the reality in New Zealand, if you look over the period of my file, or the whole period of the SIS, that there's been very little politically motivated criminality in New Zealand. So if you set up an agency to spy on people because of their politics, you're not like the police spying on criminality. You're actually spying on people because of their differences with the government. And more than that, the agency itself, because it's hiding behind secret walls, is actually taking action to inhibit dissent, reduce the effectiveness of that dissent. And you mentioned, they were corresponding with my employers when I was working at Gear Meat Works, New Zealand Motor Corporation in the Hutt Valley, and clearly trying to inhibit the work I was doing as an active unionist.
And to fill in the gaps there, when you were working at New Zealand Motor Corporation, there's a file that is identifying how you had aspirations to become the shop steward, to be elected as the union delegate, if you like, at that plant. And it's going into an evaluation of your personality and putting it into a context perhaps of where your ambitions are going politically. So it's once again, it's very thorough, and there seems to be quite an interaction between the SIS officers and people around you as well. Did you ever suspect that you were a target for the SIS during those years?
It was pretty obvious I would have been. I didn't notice the agents around. They were skilled in that sense.
So if you were looking around and suspecting I might be, there was no signs?
Partly I couldn't be bothered looking around, because why waste your time? But it was obvious from what the head of the SIS, Brigadier Gilbert, was saying at the time, and what Muldoon was saying at the time. He produced material from the SIS at one point in the early 80s, particularly to undermine the anti-apartheid movement.
In 81,
a list of people who were subversives and dangerous and all the rest of it.
I think Tim Shadbolt was disappointed he wasn't on that list, from what I understood.
Yes.
In a joking way.
And all of these people, if you look at them now, A, they weren't criminals at that stage and hadn't committed any crimes, and B, many of those people on that list are now very respected members of the community, and you see them referred to in the paper a lot.
Also, there's a file in the SIS file here where it documents how, on becoming an MP, that you and the late Rod Donald, former Green Party leader, visited HQ, as it puts, and this fairly in-depth kind of analysis that goes on relating to the discussion between the director and yourselves. Were you aware that your file could possibly still be open at that stage, or did you think that if you did have one, they would have closed it?
I would have thought they would have closed it, because spying on an MP, representative of the people, is really beyond the pale. And, you know, some marks to John Key that he did start off an investigation by the Inspector General into that, and that led to some changes.
Yes. So now it would be unlikely that an MP would...
I think they can still spy on MPs, but they have to go through a few more hoops. One of the problems is, though, that if they're spying on the, you know, people involved in active politics and different migrant groups, which the SIS is, that if an MP is communicating with those groups and working with those groups on some social justice issues, or change in the refugee rules or something like that, then the MPs get caught up in the spying, which I think was the case with me in my work with the Sri Lankan Tamils.
Yes. And just for the record there, your work with the Sri Lankan Tamils was one as an MP talking to constituents.
Yeah, I was talking to constituents, and also one of the issues there is my aim was to support, at that time there was a ceasefire in Sri Lanka, and the next step hopefully would be a peace settlement. So I was interested in talking to both sides to see what I could do back in New Zealand to get New Zealand involved in peacemaking alongside the Norwegian government that was doing a lot. But the SIS took on the agenda of other Western intelligence agencies, that the Tamil Tigers were the enemy and the Sri Lankan government was the good people, and really that approach of Western intelligence agencies and government undermined the possible peaceful solution of that dispute. And of course you had thousands, tens of thousands of people killed later on in the later years when the war resumed. And the SIS actually was going against the government of the day. That is, Helen Clark had specifically not designated the Tamil Tigers as a terrorist organisation because she wanted to keep open New Zealand's involvement in that peace process, whereas the SIS, obeying its foreign masters, took a different view. And that's one of the problems, that secret agendas develop in intelligence agencies, and their peer group is not so much the New Zealand government and the people. Their peer group is others in foreign intelligence agencies, particularly the American, British, Canadian and Australian intelligence agencies, who they meet on a regular basis and have much more interaction with than they do the Prime Minister of New Zealand.
In brief, do you believe that there is an opportunity now that the public is in a more critical space perhaps in observing the intelligence agencies, for politicians to drive ahead with a proposal to look at or perhaps reform the parliamentary oversight aspect of the interaction between the parliamentarians and the security agencies?
Yes, well, for a start, there needs to be a proper intelligence and security select committee. There isn't at the moment. There's something chaired by the Prime Minister, who also runs the show and is the busiest person in the country and doesn't pay much attention to it. So they're pretty much left on their own at the present time, and all this unnecessary stuff goes on. And there's a whole problem with the level of secrecy around the SIS and the GCSB. And that is that you get, as I think has come out recently, for a start, an efficiency. The less transparent and accountable a government body is, the more inefficient it will be. And the more people take shortcuts, the more people won't obey rules, respect privacy, etc., etc. And that's what happens in the intelligence agencies today.
So the status quo at the moment is not satisfying the observations on whether or not the SIS, the GCSB, the NA, the National Assessments Bureau are accountable.
Yes, they aren't very accountable at all. You've got a part-time Inspector General who can't do much as a part-timer, and you've got a Prime Minister who hasn't got time to do much. You've got Intelligence Security Committee, which isn't a proper select committee, that only meets occasionally and doesn't seem to do much. So they're pretty left to their own, and more adopting agendas. See, they were both agencies, the SIS and the GCSB, were essentially set up by foreign governments. The SIS was set up in the 50s, essentially by the British. That's all fairly recorded, and the GCSB in the late 70s by the Americans and the British, because they had their own electronic spy agencies and they wanted New Zealand to have one too. And Waihopai was set up, the Satellite Communications Interception Station, which is the main part of the GCSB, was set up on American British instructions and works in their interests. So you have to ask yourself, do we really need these agencies separate from the police? The police deals with real criminality, and I think we need a review to look at the pluses and minuses of continuing with the SIS and the GCSB, at least in their current forms.
Keith Locke, thank you very much.
Selwyn Manning with Keith Locke, our contender for the title of New Zealand's most spied on man. And that's all on the Beatson interview this week. Thanks for your company. We're back with more of the nation's newsmakers, same time next week. See you then, and bye for now.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.